Hey everybody, it's Garrett, and I thought today I wanted to talk about something that I recently only briefly skimmed over via a YouTube video, and it's the idea of poetry in mainstream media. Now, I didn't really watch through the entire video, and I'm not really going to respond to the video, but I will just offer some thoughts on the idea of poetry in pop culture, or media, or mainstream media, if you will. And I know that the video itself touches on a lot of different ways that poetry is perceived within films and television. This might be indicative of how we view poetry itself as a genre. However, I do think that there's some caveats that we can take. And the big caveat that I wanted to focus on is the one where a lot of just general media is directly derived from poetry and from poems throughout history. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because how a character perceives poetry in terms of like this romantic ideal or something impressionistic or something that sets the tone of an episode of a show isn't entirely the same as when you completely derive a piece of work from the poem itself. Um, and this is the main thing that I want to say is that whether or not the poetry is there at all, poetry influences a lot of the poems of throughout history, influences and inspires a lot of media even nowadays. I think the one that they provided at the very beginning of their video was Ozymandias, which was recited by Cranston in Breaking Bad. And but there's also the other aspects of poetry that find their way into mainstream culture. I think if we're just deriving directly, I mean, I want to say in about 2021, you had, or 22, 21 or 22, you had Sir Gawain and the Green Knight come out as a film. That is an epic poem told in alliterative verse with something that is known as a, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the style. Oh, bob and wheel. It is the bob and wheel stanza style. You have films and you have films directly derived from Beowulf, reinterpretations, retellings. Obviously, you have the Odyssey coming out. That is an epic poem. That is an epic Greek poem, I believe told in dactylic hexameter, if that's the correct epic style I'm referencing. And another good example of mainstream poetry that finds its way into pop culture, Paradise Lost. It is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That is one of the quotes from Paradise Lost. If you want to go into more detail on that quote, the reason why Satan actually makes that quote or makes that reference is because of the fact that the demons in hell are already at the low end of the totem pole in life and suffering. So nothing can get any worse than the state of misery that they're into, you know? Okay, anyways. But the point being that um, poetry still works its way into pop culture and our mainstream media, whether we necessarily want it to or not, because it is yet again one of those art forms that people naturally gravitate towards on some level. Maybe they don't explicitly seek it out, but sometimes they will subconsciously look for and find the poetry that they view to, sort of be something that touches on them or affects them in some way. And this is important that the poetry is, in fact, a part of our mainstream media and culture. How the characters in more contemporary types of stories and shows and movies and whatnot, how those characters perceive the poems, yeah, maybe that's the attitude of how contemporary audiences perceive poetry, but this doesn't mean that we are all perceiving said poetry in the same exact way, which I think would be another strong point that I should emphasize. We don't all perceive literature in the same way. That's why there's different ways to interpret that literature. And especially with poetry, one person's interpretation could be wildly different than another person's interpretation. As an example, I mean, I had a paper that I wrote describing how the reason why Shakespeare has such lasting longevity is because you can translate Shakespeare's plays into different sort of like mediums or styles. There was a Macbeth style play that I read or skimmed through when I was in my undergraduate, that basically it was made by a bunch of prisoners in a jail system. It was a means to express themselves. It had gang references. It had other things going on. There was another one that there was a retelling of Othello from a Chinese ballet dance company. You know, even though Shakespeare's plays aren't explicitly described as poetry, they are still using elements of poetry. They're using iambic pentameter. If you've ever used alliteration in your writing, then you are directly drawing off of elements of poetry. And I want to circle back around here. So ultimately, without really even touching on more contemporary settings within shows and movies treat poetry, that poetry is still having an effect on the pieces of media that they are found in. And I mean, even Lord of the Rings, one of the biggest fantasy series of all time. J.R.R. Tolkien was a poetry enthusiast. He did translations of Beowulf. He did translations of Sir Gawain. He did a translation of Sigurd and Gudrun. He even wrote his own poetry into his Lord of the Rings books, which, you know, bar none, they're not always the best poetry, but they're also more along the lines of like the, you know, idealist, romanticist form, if you will. Not even romanticist, more Middle Ages, medieval style. But again, that was also his area of study. And, you know, yeah, I mean, really, you can't really exclude poetry as being an unpopular form when it already finds its way organically into newer forms of media. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about this idea of how poetry plays into or is a part of our culture and the mainstream media that surrounds us. And other times, though, you know, poetry in media is small and it is just something that you read in passing. Maybe you revisit in the future. Maybe you only remember it as something to give you a mild kick in the ass for doing whatever things you're inspired to do. I don't know. Anyways, that'll do it for this video. I hope this video kind of explains or adds more on to the mainstream media and poetry. And I hope you all have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day.